And our first setting that we see is our global transparency, which adjusts our overall transparency of our entire object. And because we have a lot of other settings checked right now, let's go ahead and start out with just a default surface. And then we're going to create our own water surface by working through these different options. So we can double click on this water, and I'm going to go to Rocks and just select the first one, which is our default. And if we take a look at our preview render, we can just see that we have a completely flat surface. And we're going to go back to our global transparency, and now we can adjust this value, and we can see overall that our material eventually becomes 100% transparent. We can just turn that down. We can take a look at that value. And let's just add a bit of color. So we're going to go to the Color and Alpha tab. And we're just going to load in a color map. Go to Solid Colors. And we can select the bright blue and click OK. Go back to our Transparency tab. And we can update our preview. And we can see that showing up. And now directly underneath our global transparency is our blurred transparencies. And this gives us the ability to essentially blur what's underneath a transparent object. And we have that set up as a degree value up to from 0 degrees to 2 degrees. And we can also connect this to another node within the function editor. But keep in mind it will take a little bit longer to render blurred transparency, but we can very easily just blur whatever is underneath our transparent object. And our next option is our refraction index. Now this index is set up exactly as it would be in real life, where we have the ability to type in our refractive number. And if you take a look online, you'll be able to find charts and for specific types of materials. But basically, 1 is going to be the refraction of a vacuum. 1.333 is actually what we have a setting for water. And if we were working on glass, we would have a refraction index of 1.5. And this affects how we refract our light and everything like our objects underneath that transparent layer. And that overall refraction index is just how our light bounces once it hits the surface of that material and everything we see underneath it. So in this case, since we're replicating water, we're going to go back to 1.333. And what we can also do is check whether or not we'd like to show caustics. And what caustics are the lighter areas we're going to see from certain amounts of reflecting light sort of bunching up together. And if you've ever seen an underwater scene or a shot, you'll notice that you can see the reflections of the surface and the water movement along everything in the water, and that's all based on caustics. There's also a variety of other things that are based on caustics, if we had a glass and we had light shining through it, we would see very bright areas on the ground and the surface that the light is going through. And if we take a look at the actual preview right here, and we turn off caustics, then we remove that lighter area that we have in the center of our shadow. If we turn that back on, we can see that starting to brighten up. And this will be largely calculated by the amount of bump setting that we have. And currently we don't have a bump map on, so we're just seeing an overall flat surface. Our next set of settings is the flare options. We have intensity and span. And this is directly related to lights when they are being observed through a transparent object. And we are going to create a separate scene for that a little bit later to show those values. and mainly because our current setup is going to make it very difficult to demonstrate that. So we're going to move on, and we'll come back to that later. And we are also going to skip the effects section right now, and we're going to move on to fading out. Fading out gives us the ability to adjust basically the murkiness of our water in this case. If we're working with another surface, it would adjust the overall murkiness of that object. We have one setting, our slider at 0% is set to clear. As we increase this value, we move up to 100%, which is completely murky. And what we're adjusting is the amount of space that it takes to get from the clearest part of our object to a point where it is no longer transparent. So if we take a look at our terrain, and we can clearly see the outer reaches of our terrain and the square on the outside, but as we increase this murkiness value, we'll start to see that disappear. And we'll just turn that down, and we can start to see the shoreline slowly exposing itself. And we can just adjust how much of the objects we see underneath the transparent surface. So we can move that up. We'll move that up just a little bit higher. And now we can see that ring that we were seeing, or that square from the bottom of our terrain, is now completely gone. And it looks more realistic and more like there's actually water here. Now, of course, we don't have the bump on, so it actually doesn't look like water. But as far as the actual properties of the surface, it is replicating our water. And we've got two different options for this. We have a fade out color and our light color. And the defaults for this usually work very well for water. But if you're working on something else, then you're going to want to use a different fade out or light color. And let's just go ahead and edit this color and make it red. And now we can see that we're fading out to a completely red color, and we no longer have that blue. Our light color, which we can see around the edges, is still that bluish color that we have. So we can easily change these different fade out colors and light colors very easily, and also the overall effect and look of our water. And each of these settings can also be controlled by a specific node, and we can see that at any time when anything can be controlled by another node, we can see this extract parameter option and the ability to control that with a function. Our next option is our turn reflective with angle. Many different types of materials and things in real life are slightly reflective when they are viewed at specific angles. 40% is usually pretty good for water, and basically when we're looking at this water from above, we're not going to notice any reflection. But as we look at it, and I'm just going to go ahead and click out of this and readjust our camera, once we reach a certain angle, and we can see that now, we start to see the reflection of our terrain in the water. Now if I was to observe this directly over our terrain, we're really not going to notice any reflection at all. But that's the way a lot of transparent surfaces work, where they are going to be quite reflective at specific angles, and in some cases entirely reflective when you look at them from a certain incidence angle. So we have the ability to control that just by adjusting our turn reflective with angle. We can go all the way up to 100% from 0, and we can also control that with a function. Now if we actually want to give the appearance of water in this case, what we'll want to do is just add a bit of a bump map. So we can select bump, right mouse click, go to edit function, and now we can see our color map that's created and our defaults. Go to that bump, we can add a fractal, and then we can choose through a variety of the different patterns, and there's a lot of these that are really good for water and some of them that won't work entirely well for it. So really you have to kind of go through and see what's going to work best. As we're going through, you can see there are a lot of different options. If we go back to Perlin noises, we can see currently set to gradient. Once we go to other patterns, you can now see we have water, column, and water rough. Select our column water, change our wavelength to 0.5, and I'm going to click OK. And now if we take a look at the preview, we can see a slight bit of a change in our water, and just that overall bump is starting to show up. Now if we need to adjust the bump scale, we can do that easily just by adjusting our function. We can bring that down to 0.2. And now if we take a look at the preview, we can see a lot more turbulence, and we can see the water a little bit better. And if we wanted to create much larger waves, all we need to do is adjust our depth. If I bring this up to a large value of 5, and we take a look, we can see a lot of dips and divots in our overall water. And looking at this, it doesn't look entirely realistic with this specific function. So we could always try something else to make it look a little bit better. So let's take a look at the rest of our settings now under Transparency. And I'm going to change out what's in our scene. So I'm just going to File, New, under Default, click OK. So now that we have a blank scene, I'm just going to load in a sphere and just position ourselves. And we'll open up our Advanced Material Editor. And under Effects, the first thing we're going to take a look at is Fuzzy. Once we select Fuzzy, we can see that fading out disappears, and we're replaced with a fuzziness option, where we can adjust our material being solid to having fuzzy edges. And we can see that the more that we increase it, we have a very fuzzy material. Bring those values down, and we can see that the edge on the outside is very similar to what we would see in sort of the atmosphere of a planet. So it's a really neat way we can adjust the overall appearance of the outside of an object, and we can also control this with a fractal. So I'm going to click on here just to extract that, and now we can see the fading out output node. We have a constant, and let's change that to a fractal. Change our wavelength to 0.2, and we're using Perlin Noise's gradient. And I'm going to increase our roughness and a little bit of our gain. And click OK. And now if we take a look at the render, we can see we have some options that are fading out more in some areas than in others. And we end up with a really neat and interesting looking surface. And it creates a really nice transparency that's nice and fuzzy on the outside, so it has a nice even blend. And we can go back into our function editor just by clicking on a little arrow. And we can also see this in the function output observer, what it looks like. Bring our wavelength down if we need to, down to 0.1. And we can see that a little bit more. Maybe lower down our largest feature. We can click OK. And now we can see the effects of that. So you can see got a really neat looking surface here. And one way you could use this method is definitely to create an atmosphere for a planet. It's a really neat way. Because we can create clouds, and all we really need to do is change this color to a white, and then we can adjust the overall fuzziness of the object, and have another sort of actual planet surface underneath that, and we can end up with a really, really neat looking render. So now we can just turn off fuzziness, take a look back at our object. And if we take a look underneath fuzziness, we also have the additive function. And we can see with additive, what we're basically doing is adding all of our light and color, everything of this object to what's in the background. We can actually see a bit of a transparency through the center where we can see our horizon. This will create a very bright looking object. And we do have a lot of different things we can use this for creating very bright, semi-transparent objects. So we're going to go ahead and turn that off. we're going to increase our global transparency. And once we've done that, we can see that we have the ability to use variable transparency. But we also still have this current fade out connected, so I'm going to turn that off so that we're just working with a basic fade out. I'm going to turn that all the way to clear, and now we can select variable transparency. And now we have the ability to use a function within transparency to adjust the overall look of our object. So I'm going to click Edit Function, and under Transparency, we're just going to add another fractal node. And I'm going to make some adjustments, make this to 0.1 on our wavelength all the way across, increase our gain, and that way we have very intense colors where it's either transparent or it isn't, rather than if we take a look at the output observer where we can see the in-between values. If we bring this down, our gain, to a lower amount, we really don't see that definition in the patches. But once we bring that up higher, we can see those majorly transparent areas are really showing up, along with the areas that aren't transparent. We can click OK. And we can take a look at the preview and see this object. We also have the ability to change filters for the overall transparency and the blurring. So we can either use custom filters for that, or we can load in some of the ones that have already been created. So it's a really neat way to remove any parts of an object based on a specific function. So we can use images for this, and we can use just a variety of different techniques. And this can also be used for working on plants, where we want to use a clip map or a transparency map to remove the areas, except we just leave the leaves behind. So it's a pretty straightforward effect and technique, and we also have the function scale where we can change this separately from all of our other options. And all of that is dependent on what sort of function you create for it and the amount of nodes that you have. And I'm going to just turn off our variable transparency, which will remove that, and we now just have that global transparency option of 100%. And our last option that we want to take a look at is Enable Dispersion. And now this setting is directly connected to our reflections and also our caustics. So we're going to come back to that and set up a scene to show you how dispersion works, along with how the caustics also works. But we're going to take a look now at our reflection options. So we'll change our global transparency down to 0, and we can move on to reflection, which is fairly straightforward. Not a whole lot of settings we have here, and it's really quite easy. So our first setting is our global reflectivity. We just basically adjust how reflective the overall object is, from 0 to 100%. This value can also be controlled by a function, which means we can have only specific areas at the highest amounts and also the lowest amounts. So we have a lot of control over it that way. If you also notice, once we go above 0%, our blurred reflections are enabled. And with blurred reflections, it's pretty straightforward. We just have the ability to blur what our object is reflecting. So if we were working with a more diffuse surface, something that would be scratched, then we would notice more of a blurred reflection. Or certain surfaces where maybe the gloss or whatever's on it might not be entirely reflective, then we can blur our reflections, which will also allow us to adjust the distance in which we are reflecting. Because if we're blurring objects that are much farther away, we really don't see those objects showing up as much. So I'm going to increase this value. And let's just load something into our scene for our sphere to reflect. And let's just load in a plant. Select our plum tree. We want to move this off to the side. so we can see our sphere reflecting it. Position our camera. And we just want to take a look at that overall reflection. And we can see little bits of it on that part of the sphere. So let's go back into the Sphere Advanced Material Editor for these options. And as we bring down our blurred reflection and reduce it, we can start to see more of the crispness of our actual plant showing up as a reflection. And if I increase our global reflection to 100%, we can really see that tree in there being reflected. And we'll adjust our blurred reflection, and we can take a look and see how that is blurred. So that's a really neat option. We can also control that with a function if needed. And let's move on to the effects. I'm going to go ahead and just delete this plum tree. So we just have our sphere. And we'll go back into the material editor. And you can see we have a variable reflectivity and a use reflection map option. If we turn on our variable reflectivity, we have the ability to use a function, just as we did with our variable transparency, variable highlights, also our bumps, and it all works pretty much the same way. And what we also have is filters to control our blurring and how reflective. So we could go in here and we can disconnect our transparency that we had from before and connect our reflection to that. Click OK. And now what we can see is we only have specific areas of our material reflecting the outer scene. And then we can adjust that overall amount with our global reflective, which is one of the advantages to using variable reflectivity as opposed to connecting a node and a function directly to the global reflection. And this way we can adjust them independently, which makes it a lot easier. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn that off. And we can take a look at the use reflection map. This will allow us to, instead of reflecting the actual environment around us, we can reflect to a specific map. So I can click Load. And we can select one of our HDRI images and click OK. And now our reflection map is that exact HDRI image we loaded in. And it doesn't have to be an HDRI, although those typically do look the best. It's just a good way to overwrite the overall scene reflection and just reflect a specific image map. And then by adjusting the global reflectivity, we can adjust how much we are reflecting to that specific reflection map. So this is a very cool setting that we have available. And we can adjust the placement of this map with the U and the V offset. So we can just pretty much change where the starting point is. If you're using a non-seamless texture and you want to hide the seam, then you can adjust your offset to just hide that value. So we can turn this off. And the next thing we want to take a look at is our translucency options and our subsurface scattering. But we want to use a different object for this, because a perfectly round object is not going to really give us the best amount of detail and really represent what it is these options really do.